Well, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here. I want to welcome everybody. We've got, of course, our employees are with us here today, and then also our member engagement group. We've got about 15 or so members who are part of this group. This is our first year of trying this. We're already starting planning for next year's group. And I think it's been good, but after Pat's done today, employees will get to go back to work, and the member engagement group will stick around just for a little bit. We'll talk a little bit. This is our last meeting for the year. We've had just 4 meetings, so trying to keep it not too burdensome for the people who are in the member engagement group, and covered some good ground. We talked about just a basic co-op 101, which is covering like the history of Midwest Electric, history of electric cooperatives, and the whole board governance structure, our tradition of community involvement, why we were created in the first place. And then we did a co-op financial 101, talked about electric rates and patronage, cost of service studies, and did a little bit of a deep dive into the financials of the co-op. And then Paul did an electric distribution 101, went everything from the substation to the home, what it takes to get electricity to your meter. And then today we've got Pat O'Loughlin, CEO of Buckeye Power, who's going to give kind of an industry overview of some of the big picture stuff that's going on in the electric industry, and what it means for us as just generally as citizens, what it means for us as an electric cooperative. So I find this really, really fascinating. It's interesting. It's a little bit scary at times. So hopefully you'll also find this interesting, but not scary though. But anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much it. Help yourself to snacks there. We've got coffee and other snacks there, so just make yourself at home here. And I guess with that, we'll hand it over to Pat, and let's welcome Pat.
Well, thanks, Matt, and thank you all for having me here today to just kind of run through. I guess you went through from the substation to the meter. We're more from the power plant to the substation part of the business. We'll talk a little bit about that and some of the issues that are going on, broadly in energy. We also are the trade association for Ohio's electric cooperatives. There's 24 electric co-ops here in Ohio, Midwest being one of them, and we represent them as a trade association as well for things like we have a safety training and lineman training program. We have a government affairs program, communications. Many of you see our magazine every month that we put out. And we also have training and development for employees and directors as part of what we do in our state association. And then Buckeye Power is the generation and transmission cooperative. We generate electricity, like it sounds like. We put it onto the grid and have it delivered to each of the about 400 delivery points around the state of Ohio, where our 24 co-ops pick it up and then deliver it on to people's homes and businesses. So there's 25 electric co-ops that have service in Ohio. 24 of them are headquartered in Ohio. We serve one Michigan co-op. It's got about 1,000 meters up along the Michigan-Ohio border, and we only give power to the people that live in Ohio. So overall, that's about 1 million people across the state, about 8% of the population in the state. But we cover about 40% of the land area of Ohio with electric cooperatives. About 40% of the land area in 77 of 88 counties where co-ops serve. We generate our electricity from a variety of sources. We own, all are part of 3 coal-fired power plants, 2 of them here in Ohio. Our biggest plant is our Cardinal plant. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, over on the Ohio River between Wheeling and Steubenville. Then we're part owners of the Kyger Creek plant down near Gallipolis and the Clifty Creek plant, which is in Madison, Indiana, just along the Ohio River, just outside of Ohio. We also have 2 natural gas-fired power plants that are not too far from here. One in Van Wert County at our Moan power plant that you can see off of Route 30 as you drive by. You can look at all those windmills that you can see for miles and miles. There's about 300 megawatts of wind power up there. And you can see our little power plant that produces about 500 megawatts, and we can turn it on in 10 minutes or 20 minutes and turn it off and ramp it up and down, unlike what you can do with a windmill. And we also own a gas-fired power plant down in Greenville, Ohio, not too far from here either. We do have some renewable power. We get some hydropower from the New York Power Authority, primarily out of Niagara Falls. We have several, I think 24 now, solar facilities around the state that we provide community solar. And then we have a variety of landfill gas and biogas projects that we buy power from around the state as well. So we do have some renewable energy, and we're always looking to add, and that's where most of our new stuff has come from in the last 10 years. And then we have about 375 employees at 5 sites. Most of them work at power plants. There's about 80 people that work in our office in Columbus. We have people at our power plant sites and also at our lineman training center up in Mount Gilead, Ohio. So that's a little bit about us. We're on a fiscal year that goes till June 30th, so we're right now halfway through our year. So if I look back at last year, which was our fiscal year 2022 that ended June 30th, we had a couple of big events that happened. One is we've been partners with AEP at our Cardinal Power Plant since it was built in the mid to late 1960s. And we reached a final agreement with them we bought them out actually. We're going to continue to deliver power to them for a few more years and then close down one of the units when they stop taking power out of it. But it was good to kind of get a final chapter on our partnership as they are moving out of power generation here in Ohio. All of their customers get power that they buy from the market instead of generating anymore. As co-ops, we continue to have pretty resilient member sales. We sell to primarily residential consumers. About 60% of our sales are residential, and then about 40% go to businesses. We have very competitive rates right now, as we've always been pretty competitive. We've seen big increases by many of the utilities as they're purchasing power, and our cost of service model, where we're generating our own and buying our own materials, has made us very competitive in the current environment. We return what's called capital credits, so it's earnings that we have over time we use to reinvest in the business, and then over 15 years we return those to the members, which is to the distribution co-ops, and they in turn return money to their members. Last year we retired $37 million of earnings from previous years. We also earned $32 million last year that we used to reinvest in the business, and we took $25 million of additional earnings and we deferred that to create lower rates this year and the next couple of years. So we took $25 million of earnings that we had last year and used them to lower rates into the future because we really didn't need to make any more money than that. We are one of the most coal-intensive utilities in the country anymore, as more and more utilities have stopped using coal. And so we have to be mindful of, we're not sure due to regulations and other government actions how long we're going to be able to do that. So we got to think about what's our long-term investment in that and how will we be able to phase out of it if we need to over time, which at some point we might. And then the other big highlight this last year is we continue to have record participation in our lineman training program. I see a few people probably are part of that are in this room. We've got 140 apprentice linemen in our program today, out of a little over 300 linemen that work in the state of Ohio. So we're going through a pretty big turnover in that profession around the state. We've also developed an on-site line worker development program, and we're doing some additional advanced training for our journeyman linemen as well. Okay, so to begin to understand kind of how we get power from power plants to each local co-op, you got to start with these things called a grid operator or regional transmission organization. We're part of something called PJM, which directs the power plants and the transmission network in that shaded area across the country. So they're in about 13 states. It's about 22% of the U.S. power supply. It's everything from New Jersey down through Washington, D.C., Virginia, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, parts of Kentucky, Indiana, Michigan, all the way, and includes Chicago. So it's a big area. They're the largest grid operator in the United States, and they direct the operation of all the power plants across that network, including all of ours, as well as the high voltage transmission network that connects the power plants to major cities and facilities around this part of the country. This is a picture of our Cardinal Power Plant. You can kind of see it through the writing here. Up here at this end of the plant is the original units 1 and 2 that were built in the late 1960s. You can see we've got a new stack. When we added a scrubber on this facility, it now scrubs out the SO2, but it's got a wet flue gas, and so we had to build a new stack. These 2 stacks are no longer used. Here's our coal yard in between, and then down here about a mile away on the same site is our Unit 3 that was built about 10 years later with a little different technology, and it's sort of just a little bit of an oddball facility that was added at the end, but we've been running it for 40 plus years now. So there's 3 roughly 600 megawatt units. A megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts. Most houses use about 3 to 5 kilowatts a day, so this is enough to power, literally thousands of homes and businesses. We have put about $1.5 billion in environmental improvements into this plant out of $2 billion that we've invested in everything in the whole history of our company. Most of it has gone to environmental upgrades in the last 20 years to basically scrub out pretty much anything, any kind of emissions that come through the air. We have a water treatment plant to clean up the water that we discharge. We have a landfill that we store our ash in now, and we've pretty much done about everything you can do to clean up a power plant. So there's very low emissions and very low environmental impact today. It gets run between 80 and 95% of what it can produce by that grid operator. So they call on the most efficient power plant each hour of each day to make sure that they balance their load and generation. This is one of the least expensive plants in the region, and so it gets called on. Last week it ran about 98% of what it could produce last week. So it's getting called on, pretty much whenever it's available. We bought out AEP on August 1st, as I said, of this year. We actually AEP operated the plant for the first 50 years that we were partners. We took over operations of the plant in 2018, which is a big change for us as a company. And we did that because we had more of a long-term interest in the plant and where it was going to go, and we thought that we could do a little better job in managing this one plant. AEP is a really great company. They manage lots of power plants as a big fleet. We thought we could manage this one power plant to be the best power plant it could be a little more effectively, and I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. So we're going to continue to supply electricity to AEP up through 2028, and then our contract's going to end, and we're going to retire this Unit 3 down here, and we're going to keep these 2 original units to take care of the co-op needs going forward. And that's because those 2 units are actually a little more efficient, even though they're older, and they have very common equipment, and they share a lot of spares and other things, so they're operationally easier to run, and we can do it with a few less people because they're right there together as opposed to being a mile apart. So for all those reasons, that's our plan going forward there at Cardinal. That's the Ohio River, obviously, here in the foreground as well. So this is the emissions profile from, this is kind of what we've been able to accomplish by spending that money on technology. These are the 2 primary air pollutants that we used to worry about, sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. That's what it used to look like in 1990, which was relatively uncontrolled, where we were putting out tens of thousands of tons of that emissions. Now we're a few thousand tons of emissions a year from that entire plant. So it's really gone down to almost immeasurable, frankly, today with what we put out there. We've kind of been able to bend the cost curve. This is what AEP was spending on day-to-day running of the plant, about $113 million a year in the last 3 years they were operating it. We've been able to lower that about $10 million by really focusing on kind of being more efficient on how we run things. We've been able to reduce staff and just be a little more effective in running things. And so that's something we thought we could do, and it's good to see that we were able to accomplish that over the last 5 years. Mostly, though, by buying this plant, it gives us certainty about our future and less to worry about with what AEP might do. So we have these obligations to them for a few years. They're going to continue to participate and pay for their fair share for a while. And then we're going to start writing off our Unit 3, which we're going to retire, and that's going to take about 12 years to write down the full costs of the investments that we have in that. This is a chart that shows what our rates have been over the last 10 or 12 years. You can see from 2012, when we finished building our environmental control equipment for the most part, we had about 10 years where our rates were essentially flat. But there's a lot of things, moving underneath the surface, but we were able to keep things flat. The last couple of years, they've crept up as we've seen higher fuel costs primarily, and we've also continued to see higher grid costs. So what we call transmission, the costs that we have to pay to transport our electricity from our power plants to your local co-ops has gone up substantially. And this kind of gives that little breakdown. These are the two sort of variable costs that we have in our business. One is fuel, which is this blue line, which you can see we were able to actually have that come down for quite a while. It sort of popped back up in the last couple of years. This red line is our cost of transmission, or the grid services to take our power from our power plant to the local co-ops. And you can see that was about $5 a megawatt hour in 2010, and it's going to be about $20 a megawatt hour here in recent years. So there's been a lot of money put into the power grid, and it comes back to us in higher costs that we have to pass on as part of our rates. And so that's the combination of the two. You can see this lowering of fuel kind of offset this increase for a while, but now these last couple of years we've seen this uptick because both are going up, both fuel and transmission costs. As we think about just sort of energy markets generally, you know, we've all seen it, right? Everything's going up, not just energy, but energy is a big part of what's causing a lot of the inflation that we see right now. We've seen rapid increases in pretty much every kind of fossil fuel. What you pay for coal, gasoline, diesel fuel, propane, natural gas is up about 3x from what it was just a few years ago. Coal and natural gas are our two biggest inputs to producing electricity, and today we're paying about 3 times what we paid a couple years ago for the basic inputs. Now we average our coal purchases over time, so we're sort of gliding into those higher costs right now. And our coal generation is dispatched almost all the time because it's still quite a bit cheaper than natural gas costs are. The market price for, so you know, just to put this in perspective, our rates are now around 8 cents a kilowatt hour. That's what we charge, or $80 a megawatt hour, which is 1,000 kilowatt hours. About 8 cents is what we're charging today to co-ops average around Ohio. The price that Ohio investor-owned utilities like AEP and Dayton Power and Light are paying somewhere between $100 and $120 a megawatt hour for that same thing today. So we've kind of become a bargain here in recent years. They offer what they call a standard service offer, default service, and those rates are going to go up anywhere from 25% to 100% over the next year ahead. So we're going to see continued increases in electricity prices from the investor-owned utilities in Ohio. We're going to see gradual increases here for the co-ops, but pretty significant jumps still ahead for the investor-owned utilities here in Ohio. And they're very representative of what's going around the rest of the country. Electricity prices, U.S., are up about 15% from a year ago. In Ohio, investor-owned utilities are up 15 to 20% from a year ago. Co-op prices are up about 3 to 5%, depending on which co-op it is, from a year ago. So we're doing better than most right now. And then you've probably seen in the news right now that you're seeing peak period supply deficiencies are being predicted in many parts of the country. We've seen, you know, blackouts in California. We saw it in Texas. Right now in the Midwest, west of here, west of Illinois, they're predicting potential shortages during the winter. In New England, they're saying as long as it's not cold, everything will be fine. Okay. The story is kind of the same thing I just talked about. We're seeing more and more utilities retiring older coal-fired power plants because they don't want to make the environmental investments. They're not as committed to the long-run cost control as co-ops are. And so we're seeing retirements that are straining our power supply grid. We used to have ample supplies during any kind of conditions, and now we have barely enough on days when we're stressed. I will say this PJM power grid that we're connected to we're the best shape of any of the power grids in the country, but we're still not nearly as good a shape as we used to be. So we're seeing a steady degradation in the reliability and the resiliency of our electric system because of retirements of plants for economic reasons, mostly by larger utilities. This is just that wholesale rate comparison I was talking about before. Here's this blue line is what Buckeye charges our co-ops, and it's gone from about 7 cents to 8 cents over time. And then you can see the other investor-owned utilities in Ohio kind of bumped around up and down, very similar to us. And in this last year have gone up considerably higher than where we have been. And that's likely to continue, as I said, for at least the next couple of years. This is if you buy from a competitive retail supplier. So if you're an AEP customer or a Dayton Power and Light customer, you can go out and buy from the market from a competitive supplier. This is kind of the rates that the larger ones are charging. And again, this is compared to our roughly 8-cent rate. So electricity prices are up considerably around the state of Ohio for non-co-op consumers pretty much everywhere. One of the big news items this last year has been the U.S. EPA versus the state of West Virginia and several utilities. We were originally part of that suit as well, where the EPA said that they could regulate carbon dioxide and basically tell utilities how they could generate power going forward. We won that case, which was a pushback to the EPA. They're still allowed to regulate carbon dioxide because they're the environmental protection. They are allowed to regulate emissions, but they just said, hey, you guys have gone too far in trying to control how the power grid works, and that's outside of what you're authorized to do, which frankly is a big win because they don't really know much about how the power grid works, even though they wanted to tell us how to run it. So that was a big win, I think, going forward on a pushback of how much authority the EPA has over the power industry. But here's a quote from the EPA administrator, which says, we're just going to make fossil fuel power so expensive that clean energy will look cheap, is basically that's what he's going to try to do. And so we're going to be fighting with them in court, I think, for the next several years, it looks like. That's the way things set up. We're faced with a federal government that wants to put fossil fuels out of business, and they want to do it quickly. And we represent people that have an interest in reliable electricity that they can afford, and so those two things we're gonna have to fight about, I guess, for a while. This is that same sort of PJM footprint that I showed you before. Here's Pennsylvania, Virginia, Chicago over here. Every dot on there is a power plant that's been retired in the last 11 years now. The bigger the dot is, the bigger the power plant. That's a lot of power plants. It's 38,000 megawatts, or about 25% of the traditional coal-fired power plants have been retired in that region since 2011. And 20,000 megawatts, or about 15% of the entire capacity in that region, has been retired since the polar vortex in 2014, when we were very close to having to curtail electric supply in 2014. I don't know if you remember that, but it was pretty darn cold that year. And none of those power plants work anymore. So we've added a few natural gas power plants in the meantime, but we definitely have a much tighter supply situation regionally than we ever had. And as I told you, this region of the country is in the best shape of any place in the country right now. So that's just what's happening. A lot of companies and industries are talking about their carbon reduction plans and commitments to zero and things like that. Our company does not have a carbon reduction plan. We plan to make electricity reliable and affordable and live within whatever rules and regulations that we have to operate within. We do know if we do need to reduce our carbon dioxide due to regulations or other reasons, how we're going to get there pretty easily. They come in pretty big chunks. We will have 2 coal-fired power plants. Each one is about 35% of our emissions today. The part ownership that we have in the other 2 power plants would add another 20%. So we could, make these reductions by retiring plants if we need to, and we recognize that may happen. We're trying to be financially responsible, so if we have to, we can do that in a financially responsible way. So by the mid-2030s, we could make a 35 or 40% reduction in our CO2 emissions with normal load growth by retiring coal and adding natural gas power plants. That's something we could do. But I think the big question is, what if electrification of cars particularly adds 25% to electric demand? That's what most people are predicting. By 2030, we're going to have about 25% more electricity demand from cars. So how's that going to work? I think that's, so we're kind of going to wait and see, I think, before we jump ahead of this. We're going to see how this plays out. And then just talking about CO2 emissions. So this is the U.S. CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use going back from 2005 when we started talking about this through 2019. I didn't put 2020 and 2021 on here because we had COVID and it dipped down in 2021, it bounced back, but basically we're about the same level as we were in 2019 right now. But the U.S. is down about 14%, lower CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use than we had in 2005. You don't read that very often, but that's where we are. We're down 14%. Almost all of it, that's 853 million tons reduction. 800 million of that 853 has come from the power supply sector. So power plants are emitting way less carbon dioxide than they used to, about 33% lower than it was just in 2005. We've kind of done what we can do, and we're getting kind of dangerously close to doing too much at this point. So yeah, 14% down in the U.S. Well, meanwhile, worldwide emissions are up almost 25% in that same period. So they've not only offset our reductions, but overall worldwide emissions of carbon dioxide are up 25% in that same period. So, I guess I have a hard time feeling like this is a big U.S. problem, and I certainly feel like it's hard to pin this on the U.S. power industry when we are by far the biggest reduction of CO2 emissions of anything in the world has been through the U.S. power industry and what's happened over that same time period. We've been part of the solution. There is a problem in that we still have significantly increasing emissions that we're going to have to deal with, but it's really not from here in the U.S., and it's certainly not from the power industry. Here's just kind of where emissions come from by the three main sources in the U.S. This red line is power sector emissions, and you can see how dramatically that's come down in that time frame. The blue line is transportation, or cars and trucks, and you can see that's down a tiny bit, but it's basically flat. Now we're expecting that to come down quite a bit here as we add more electric cars, which don't have emissions, but that's going to put pressure here on power because we're going to have to use more power to get there. And then kind of everything else, which is heating your homes and businesses and industry and all that, has basically been flat over that same time period. So that's just kind of what's really happening. Whatever you think about CO2 emissions or how much we need to reduce them, that's just sort of the facts and what's been happening. This is kind of how we got there. This is how the U.S. supplies electricity to our nationally. This black section is how much electricity we get from coal. In 2011, just 11 years ago, we were getting a little over 40% of our electricity from coal in this country. Today, in 2020, it was down to about 20%. So half. We've reduced the electricity we get from coal by half. Natural gas has gone up substantially. It was about 20% back in 2011. Today, it's about 40% of our electricity comes from natural gas, which, fortunately, we've had a great abundance of natural gas from hydraulic fracking and others. Ways of recovering it that we didn't used to have. The one big worry about natural gas for electric generation, though, is what we haven't done. There's just not enough delivery system to get gas to everybody that wants it on the coldest day of the year. Nuclear power is this yellow one that's been steady at about 20% of our power supply for the last 25 years. That's under a little bit of pressure. It's starting to decrease a little bit, but it's close to 20%. The blue is hydro, which has been like 6 or 7% for the last 50 years. And then the green is wind and solar, which has gone from just about 2% to over 10% in that same time frame. So we're getting a lot more wind and solar. You see it, around Ohio. It's even bigger in other parts of the country. A lot less coal and a lot more natural gas. That's kind of what's happening to our power grid and how we're supplying electricity. You might remember in Texas, they had that winter storm Uri a couple of years ago. And they had to black people out for about 3 days. It was supposed to be rolling blackouts, but they could never turn them back on. And I will tell you that I'll just compare and contrast the Texas grid, or ERCOT as they call it, with our PJM grid. And you can see we both have about the same amount of natural gas that we rely on. But here in PJM, we have a lot more coal than they have in Texas, and a lot more nuclear than they have in Texas. Now, they have a lot more wind and solar. We depend very little on wind and solar here in this part of the country, partly because it's a lot windier and it's a lot sunnier in Texas than it is here in Ohio and Pennsylvania and our surrounding states. But they've gone all in on that, and they've faced the consequences of having a less reliable power grid when you don't have sources. These are available when they're available. There's no control over those. All these other sources you can control. You can turn them on, you can turn them off, you can ramp them up, you can ramp them down. And that's what our power system has historically depended on, is we control our plants to meet your demand for electricity. More and more we're trying to get people to control their demand for electricity to meet what our power plants can produce. And And that works okay when it's voluntary, not so great when it's forced upon people. Here's what we're seeing for prices going forward. This is just coal and natural gas prices. The blue line is sort of the local delivery of natural gas. You can see back here as recently as 2021, it was in the $2.50 range. It's been as high as $9 this summer. Right now, the forward price is between $5 and $6. So we're seeing, double to triple natural gas prices that we saw just a little over a year ago. Coal prices have been just as dramatic. We've gone from $1.50 a million BTUs to up over $7 a million BTUs, and they've settled out in the $4 or $5 range. Our costs are going to be lower than that because we average in our purchases over years, so we're still buying some of this cheap stuff along with some of this expensive stuff and averaging it in over time. But that is a trend that we're going to have to get used to, which is higher energy prices. I don't see anything that's going to push these things back down to where they were. You can see they've settled out a little bit at not as high as they were earlier this year, but I think we're going to have to get used to higher energy prices generally. Yeah.
Can you talk about what's causing that?
Well, so I think the simplest version of it is underinvestment in either business, and largely because the federal government has put a pretty concentrated effort on reducing fossil fuel use into the future, both today and into the future. There's less permitting, and then there's just less investment. If you owned a coal company, how much would you be investing in your future today? People that own natural gas resources are scaling back what they're investing because it's uncertain how long they're going to be able to produce and what kind of regulatory pressures they're going to face or taxes or other things. So mostly it's just been a lack of investment that has sort of caught up with it. Now, the other thing that really caused this thing to spike, and that started back here in the spring of 2021, was when Russia invaded Ukraine. Natural gas is now sort of a worldwide commodity. We used to keep it all here in the United States. We now ship about 12 to 15% of our production goes on boats and goes to the rest of the world to supply them at much higher costs than what we pay for it, by the way. And so it's more of a worldwide demand. And what's happened with Russia invading Ukraine has shut off some of the supplies, but it's also made most of the world realize that it's probably not a great idea to rely on Russia for anything going forward. And so I think that's going to permanently change, supply relationships around the world. It's going to permanently is a long time, but for a generation at least, it's going to cause probably people to rely more on countries like the United States, even at higher costs, to supply their energy needs, because a lot of the world is still dependent on imports of energy. We're fortunate that we're able to produce enough here to meet most of our needs if we want to. The want to is kind of a hard part, though. But I would call it chronic underinvestment. Coal is certainly suffering from that. Coal prices are largely throttled by lack of supply because people are just not investing in further production. And we get worried about how many mines we're going to be able to buy from, frankly, as they've closed down as well. That might have more to do with our future in coal than our power plants, is the supply of fuel to them. Okay, so just kind of looking ahead for us, we've kind of cleaned up our future with AEP. We've got a relatively clear view of what's going to happen with our power plants, at least for the next few years, and then a relatively hazy view of how we're going to get treated in a regulatory sense going forward. But at least we know that's something we face. Our cost-based generation is very competitive with market-based pricing. Transmission cost has been going up substantially. We still have some service, we're paying a lot more, and we still have some service reliability concerns where we have some of your substations go out from time to time, and Matt calls us up and is pretty unhappy about it, and I don't blame him. So we're trying to make sure that we get value out of the money that we're spending for that. We're going to continue to focus on improving our plant operations. I think we've got a ways to go to continue to improve what we do. Controlling our costs, having disciplined investments. We are investing in our business, but we try to do it in a smart and a disciplined way. And then working on workforce development and kind of skills and decision making that people make, because everybody matters and you all have to make decisions every day that that impact our business, and trying to make sure that we make the best ones we can day in and day out is important to us. We have had a kind of a benefit of financial gains because we produce more electricity than our members use, and so we sell that into the market. We've been making a good amount of money doing that in the last couple of years, and we're finding ways to roll that back into keeping your rates as low as we can. So that's one of the reasons why our rates haven't gone up as much, is because we are returning those excess revenues back in lower rates, and we're going to keep doing that. This whole discussion about decarbonizing our economy and what does that look like and what does that mean is, I think, finally starting to change a little bit as people are realizing, like, wait a minute, does that mean, we might not have electricity on the coldest day of the year? Wait a minute, I'm not sure I'm ready for that. So I see some glimmers of sense coming into the discussion, as opposed to just like, we're going to be zero by this date goals, which we've heard a lot of the last couple of years. Oops. I talked about this. We have concerns about having adequate baseload controllable generation, the stuff we can turn on and run up and down when we need it. We've gone through lots of retirements. We really need to stabilize our system and deal with the growth that we know we're going to see in electric cars. We're going to have more electric demand from cars. We know that. It's not sure how much yet. And then the last thing that we're working on is we're introducing legislation this year in Ohio to take some of the tax dollars that we collect in everybody's electric bill, and instead of giving them to the state to go into the big pot at the state, to be able to direct them towards community development projects that will have a local impact in the communities that we serve. And that's going to be a big push you're going to see out of us for the next year, maybe the next couple of years until we get it done. But we really think that's the right thing to do with some of these taxes that we're collecting, is to have a greater impact on these rural communities and make sure that that money stays put and helps with local development projects. Because we all know each of these communities has needs, and it's hard to get funding, and if you got to go to the state to get it, that's one thing. If we can keep it local and use it for local projects, we think that's going to be a win-win for our communities that we serve. So that's something that we're going to be working on with the state legislature here in the next year, and hopefully we'll be very successful, but we'll see. It's going to be an uphill fight. So that's the nutshell what I put together. I talked kind of fast. Only Matt asked a question. So
I got another one.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you go back to that PJM retirement?
I sure can, I think. Yep, that one.
So there's, some new big business coming into the area, Intel, and then there's the one in southwestern Ohio. I forget who that is, but
yep.
You probably know better the megawatt scale that those are.
Yeah.
Maybe talk a little bit about, does anyone have any concerns about how are we going to, I think it's great.
It is great.
But are there any concerns about how this is going to match up with available capacity?
Yeah, so, there's a lot going on. You look at any one piece. As a country and as a state, we've been getting more and more efficient in how we use electricity. Most people do more with less electricity at their homes and in their businesses. We went from incandescent lights to fluorescent lights to LED lights. That took about 12% of the demand out of electricity over about 10 years. That's a big change. Every refrigerator you buy today uses about 25% as much electricity as one you bought 20 years ago. So there's a lot of efficiency that's happening that is kind of slowly pushing things down. And then there's these big businesses like data centers and Intel that come in and plop down a couple hundred megawatts of load, which is, tens of thousands of homes worth of savings, in one big lump. So overall, Ohio's electricity demand has been relatively flat. It's up a couple percent from 10 years ago. As co-ops, we're up about twice as much as average, but we're only up about 10 or 15% from 10 years ago, say. And what we've seen with the big businesses that are locating here, to your question, is that they're, number one, I think, landing here in Ohio because, as I told you before, even though we've got some problems with these retirements, we're still by far in the best shape of most of the country as far as an electric supply. And there's a reason that they're here, is because they need a reliable supply of electricity. And then, for PR reasons and other, they're also funding these large solar and wind developments that you see around the state, so that they can claim that they're buying all their power from renewable energy, which we know doesn't really work, but whatever, that's sort of a PR thing. But they are funding these really mega solar farms that you're starting to see pop up around the state, and some of the big wind farms are mostly being built to supply those large businesses. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Intel is probably going to do the same thing, I suspect. I'm not sure yet. But so, and did that answer your question?
Yeah. How about wind and solar and battery? You talk a little bit, especially with battery storage, the ability to, like at what point, you showed the chart where coal and natural gas are at a certain level,
Yeah.
and maybe decreasing, and wind and solar increasing. At what point does it become a reliability concern that it's just not going to be able to, the capacity just doesn't match up?
Yeah, so in different parts of the country we're there already today. Like the upper Midwest is very dependent on wind because it's very windy. We participated in a wind farm in Iowa for 10 years because it's pretty windy in Iowa. We get like 50% more output out of a wind turbine in Iowa than you get in Ohio. Thought, okay, that's a good idea. Well, we learned a few things. One is pretty much every wind turbine in the United States on land, it's not offshore, but on land, produces about twice as much electricity at night as it does during the day. Did you know that? I didn't know that. We do now. Guess what? People use about twice as much electricity during the day as they do at night. Okay, so it's completely out of kilter with how people use electricity. Solar, California's got a lot of solar, and they've gone from what used to have a peak in the afternoon to now they have this big valley in the middle of the day around noon to 1 o'clock when solar is at its highest point. And then as it starts to get dark is when they have their peak electricity demand now because the solar goes off and they have a lot of it. So batteries is a way to shift that. That's kind of the big promise. The batteries we have today, though, at best will last 3 to 4 hours. At something close to full output, which is it's a little less than that, but close to that. So you can move, 3 or 4 hours at the most, more likely 2 to 3 hours. Well, that helps a little bit with solar. It moves it a little bit closer to peak, but it doesn't get you. It still gets dark, and then there's still the next hour after that, right? So it really, it's hard to see how the batteries we have today are going to significantly help wind and solar do the kinds of things that natural gas and coal and other resources can do. People are talking about batteries that last, 10 hours and 12 hours. And you know what that is today? It's 4 3-hour batteries sitting right next to each other because that's how long they last. So, there's definitely R&D going on in batteries, and maybe someday somebody will come up with it. But both California and Texas, which are the windiest, sunniest parts of the country, both have periods of at least 9 days every year where the wind doesn't blow. At least 9 days every year. So you're not going to get a 9-day battery no matter what. So wind is, I think, going to be more limited going forward. Solar, at least you get some solar. Almost even right now, we'd be getting some solar. It'd be about 10% of what it should be. But solar is probably going to be a bigger part of the future, and batteries are going to help. Batteries are also very expensive. We're at, so this is like 11 or 12% of our electric supply is coming from wind and solar right now. Batteries cannot supply 1/10 of 1% today, not even 1/100th of 1% today with all the batteries that are out there today, which is, they're relatively early on, but, to scale them up 100 times, 1,000 times just to get to 10%, okay, we're a long way from that, and that's a lot of money. So I just don't think any of the current battery technologies that we have today are going to be the answer to that. We're going to need a better idea before those are going to really move the needle, I think, on wind and solar. Yeah.
Hey, Pat. So with the Power Siting Board, they've given a lot of ownership to local counties to allow or disallow solar fields, wind, even set up shop. And it doesn't matter which county in Ohio you're in, it sounds like they're all a big pushback for any major developments. Is that going to change, or is that the new norm?
Well, you all would know better than I. I mean, a lot of that came out of really the wind development here in Northwest Ohio and the community impact that had, and the negative reactions a lot of people had caused the state to say, well, we need to put more local control over how your community gets developed. What I see is a lot of negative pushback on any of the really large-scale developments. There are still some being built. Most of those have already been sited. There will still be some more. There's places in Ohio still where that'll still be developed, but I think it's limiting. When I talk to people around the country, Ohio is probably a little further ahead on giving back community control, but you're seeing the same kind of concerns about local impacts in a lot of the country, particularly areas that are traditionally agricultural, where you're taking prime farmland out of production. You can go to West Texas. There's a lot of West Texas where they really can't do much anything with it, and other parts of the country where they probably will develop a lot of that. But I think in places that are agricultural in nature, it's going to continue to be more and more difficult to do these really large-scale developments anyways. Yeah.
Can I speak to that for just a second?
Sure.
Up in Van Wert County, they just approved a 750 megawatt solar project, I think.
So that's about 15,000 acres probably, to more than that even.
It's about 1,200 acres.
1,200 acres, okay.
Got my numbers mixed up. Anyways, we got buy-in from the community school. I'm on Lincoln View School Board, and schools get about 56% of tax revenue that is paid by landowners. And we got a lot of community buy-in and approval from the community with the siting board. The school was giving up some of their revenue back to the township, and the township is putting that money as rebates and property taxes to the landowners in that township. So the township people have bought into it because they're getting a piece of what the solar farm is producing too, instead of just the schools and the county and the library and the parks and other things. So it seems like you can get better buy-in if you're recycling it back into the community. So that was one way to get the buy-in.
What's in it for me is right on everybody's mind about everything. So yeah, right. Yeah, so we'll see that, but I do think it's and maybe that's the pathway where you're going to see more. We're going to have more wind and solar, no matter how much and at what scale. I think that there's no doubt we're going to continue to see more development. It's just a matter how much and how fast and what's the scale look like. We just did a 12-acre development in Hancock County, and that was sort of like, well, is that too big? I don't know. Some people thought so. Some people were fine with it. That was our biggest one to date, Yeah.
Just curious if you knew, is there any estimate as to how much of the US's coal we have used? I mean, coal's been one of the first things we started using.
Yeah, we've got a lot. I mean, it depends. It's very regional and localized. Where our plant sits over on the Ohio River is, I call it like sort of the Saudi Arabia of coal in the United States. In the Pittsburgh, northern Appalachian area, we have really high quality reserves that for the amount of power plants that we have left today. By the way, we're not going to get any more coal plants. Every time one of those goes away, there's not a new one that's going to be built. We haven't built a coal plant in this country in about 15 years. We've only built about 2 or 3 in the last 25 years, and we're not going to build any more in the foreseeable future. So what we have is what we're going to have. So we easily have hundreds of years of coal left for the plants. The Powder River Basin is an insult to mining, I guess, is what the miners all say, because they're digging up seams of 70 feet thick of coal, and there's a lot of that still left too. So there's a lot of coal in this country still that could be used, and it's pretty well known where it is and how to get to it. Natural gas seem like we got a lot of that. I think that's a little more unclear how long that will last, and because we're definitely using more of that, but there's quite a bit of natural gas still available too right now.
Could the anti-fracking, hamper that dramatically, though?
It could. I think the good news for that is that we've been doing it for like 15 years in lots of the country, and with pretty limited negative. Everybody was really worried about your faucet was going to catch on fire and things like that, which really hasn't happened. So I think we've sort of seen what the impacts of most of that are, and they've gotten better at making it safer and more reliable. So I think that's a pretty proven technology at this point. There's always different views about development, but I think that's pretty mature at this point as a something we know how to do and to do safely and with little environmental impact. Yeah.
Nuclear hasn't changed much.
Nope.
Is it safety? Is it waste? What is it?
It's cost mostly, number one. We went through the 1980s. 3 Mile Island happened in the late 70s, and the cost of nuclear construction exploded from safety concerns around that. And a lot of nuclear plants never got finished. The ones that did cost a lot more than they expected, and the price of nuclear power was more than anybody expected. So through the 1990s, the nuclear industry set out to say, okay, what we need to do is get a standardized design that's safer, that's got a passive system, doesn't depend on all these complicated systems that won't melt down no matter what. And they came up with that and sold a couple of them here in the U.S. And they started building them, and then 9/11 happened. And so the Nuclear Commission said, well, wait a minute, what if somebody flies an airplane into your nuclear reactor, then what? And so they had to go back and kind of redesign that. They were building 2 of them in South Carolina that they canceled after spending about $7 billion on them. And they got nothing to show but like some concrete foundations right now, and so a lot of spare parts. They're building 2 in Georgia right now. They're going to end up costing about $30 billion, which, they're big developments, but that's a lot of money no matter what. So that electricity is going to cost more than $100 a megawatt hour if those plants run for 70 or 80 years. That's kind of, if they spread it over that, that's expensive electricity still. It's not crazy expensive, but it's expensive. And it costs about 3 times as much as they thought it was going to cost. So there's not very many companies that can, and oh, by the way, Westinghouse, the biggest, the designer and builder, and Chicago Bridge and Iron, their primary supplier, and Toshiba, the company that owned Westinghouse, all went bankrupt during that project too. So the nuclear industry is kind of in disarray from the same problem they had in the 80s, which was out of control costs. And they're sort of tied to safety. I mean, you can't really separate them too much, but it makes it really hard for the next. So, and oh, by the way, it takes from the day you say, I need a nuclear power plant, to the day you start making electricity, at least 20 years. And it takes about between 5 and 10 to build it, and at least 10 to get it sited and permitted. So, and that's not getting better. So it's just really hard for a company to say, yeah, I want to sign up for one of those. Maybe we'll fix that, but I don't see it soon. And if we do, it's still 20 years till the next one comes. So, yeah. So we got a 20-year, and I know if we're really serious, like decarbonization is what we really need to do, and we really need to get low on CO2 emissions, and we're going to have to do more nuclear power. I think that's because none of these other things work, to my point before, or at least they're not going to work in the next 10 or 20 years. And I think that's the other thing is people just got to get real about timeframes. People are saying, well, by 2030 we're going to do this. Like, well, that's not going to happen, okay? You can talk about it all you want. It's not going to happen. By 2050, could it? Maybe. But we have to get busy on a lot of these things if that's going to happen even, and probably a lot of nuclear power plants, for one thing. Yeah.
Can the same be for hydro? I don't know much about hydro or anything else of that nature. I mean, I just know that, we're 6 hours to Niagara Falls, and that's not that far.
Yeah.
But
the problem with hydro is it's a limited. There's only one Niagara Falls, right? And we're tapping it out. We've been tapping it out for 70 years now. And actually, some of the other big hydro resources are in the western U.S., and they're mostly talking about tearing down dams, not built. And so I don't think that we're going to see much more hydropower. There's just not that many rivers that have the drop that you get a lot of power out of. The Ohio River's got some hydro facilities on it, but they're very small, and they're kind of intermittent because the Ohio River's kind of a slow-rolling river. You've been at Niagara Falls, you've seen the Ohio River, you can tell the difference, right? They're not the same thing. And so yeah, it's not going to be much more. If anything, it's more likely to be less. Yeah.
I'm not sure this is just all science fiction, but I thought one time I heard you talk about possibly putting solar arrays up in space.
Yep.
And beaming it down. Do you ever hear about that?
Well, solar works great in outer space because there's no clouds. You can get it all day long. The beaming it down part is kind of tricky. We haven't really figured that out, although theoretically there's maybe a way to do that, but yeah, I'm not sure you want to live next door to the station that receives it, but people don't even like big power lines right now. Think about that. But Yeah, there's a lot of solar in outer space. I think getting it here is pretty tricky. Maybe someday. I don't think they're gonna have wires going up there. Yeah. Yeah.
With the amount of coal and fossil fuel stuff getting shut down more and more, and I see that you're looking at cutting Plant 3 down. What was the determining factor with the fact of being able to possibly sell that on the market to regulate or even out our costs and our rebates back to not only Midwest Co-op, but all the other members in that? What was the deciding factor in that?
Well, it is kind of goes back to this. So when electricity prices are down here, we're losing money to own that plant for those years, and so we're not as the Ohio co-ops all put together, we're about 1% of the demand in this PJM region, 1.2%. We're not going to hold up the world with our 1%, and so we're going to do our fair share, and we just don't need it for our members, and that's what we're really built for, is to take care of our members' requirements. And to just have a lot of extra and hope it works out is just sort of gambling on something that, and then the other thing is we had to make a commitment to either make a big investment in the next environmental thing or close it down by 2028. And so we've already told them we're not, well, AEP didn't want to pay for their share of it. So we said, well, we're not going to pay for their share either. So it's pretty much a done deal. And like I said, most of these things become irreversible pretty fast. So we're going to take care of ourselves, and we're not going to be able to fix the world. And we've had a lot of discussion about just that. What you said, though, is like, well, should we just keep it and have it? Maybe, but we're really not in the business to make those kind of big bets for on behalf of, what if we're wrong? Do you really want to pay an extra $50 a month in case we're wrong? Anybody else?
Is there any discussion, you said that the hardest part about the coal plant is getting coal in the future. Has there been any discussion maybe buying a coal mine or something? I know it's a lot of money, but just...
We actually owned a coal mine once, and so no. It's a really complicated business, and it's hard enough running power plants. So I don't see us doing that anytime in the future. We have scars from the coal mines that we did own. There's just a lot of problems that go with a captive mining operation, is with labor, with just cost control, and then closure and environment. It's just I'll put it this way. I'm not going to work long enough to own a coal mine. Put it that way. Maybe the next guy will. I don't know. It's tough. It's a tough business. But I think what we're trying to do is develop partnerships with the companies that we have had long-term relationships with, where we could, give them a longer-term, more steady supply of revenue so that they could invest in their business. That's what our goal is. Right now, things are so volatile; it's just hard to get people to think long-term right now. We're, as co-ops, we're kind of uniquely positioned in being able to do that. A lot of businesses are very short-term in nature, and coal mines are one that are a little longer term because they're big, lumpy investments they have to make to keep them running. But we're one of the few people that are really looking long term. I mean, AEP is not thinking about power generation at all right now, nor is Dayton Power and Light or any other Ohio utilities for that matter. Private equities who's kind of buying coal plants and coal mines right now. And they're more short-term focused generally.
Any other questions for Pat?
Well, thanks. Those are great questions. It was a lot of fun being here with you. Appreciate you inviting me.